It's dark, it's quiet, and out of nowhere, there's a knock. You might wonder who could be at your door at this hour. Should you open it? Sometimes it's best to ignore that knock. Some things are better left outside, never to be let in. In this episode, we've prepared chilling stories about encounters with the black-eyed children. So get comfy, settle in, and enjoy. If you liked them, please subscribe for more. It was a Friday night around 9 p.m. and I was babysitting for the Johnsons. Their little girl, Sophie, was fast asleep upstairs, and I had just finished cleaning up the kitchen after dinner. I wasn't expecting much more from the evening. A quiet night of snacks, TV, and maybe catching up on my phone. The house felt cozy, the warm light of the living room casting soft shadows, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly peaceful. I decided to settle on the couch and flipped through channels, landing on some reruns of old shows, the kind you don't really have to pay attention to, but are comforting in the background. I had a soda on the coffee table, my phone nearby, and was already planning to scroll through social media when I heard it. A knock at the door. 3 sharp bangs. Not a gentle knock, not the type you'd expect from a neighbor stopping by or someone delivering a package. It was firm, quick, and louder than it should have been. I paused, sitting up a little straighter. It was strange. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the Johnsons hadn't mentioned any visitors or packages. I glanced at the time on my phone. It was late, at least for someone to be coming by unannounced. I stood up slowly, my heart already starting to pick up its pace. A weird feeling was gnawing at the back of my mind. Something about the knock felt wrong. Too loud, too sudden. I crept toward the front door, but stopped just short of it. Instead of opening it right away, I leaned toward the small window beside the door and pulled the curtain back just a little to peek out. 2 kids were standing on the porch. A boy and a girl, maybe around 10 or 11, standing side by side. I blinked in surprise, wondering what they were doing out here so late. They didn't look like they were from the neighborhood. Both of them were dressed strangely, almost like their clothes were out of a different era, plain, old-fashioned, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in old family photos. Their skin was pale, almost too pale, like they hadn't seen the sun in a while. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at them through the glass, trying to figure out what to do. Then the girl spoke without even looking at me. Her voice was soft, but unnervingly flat, like she was just reciting words. "Can we come in? We need to borrow your phone." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Something about the way she said it, the way they were standing there, just didn't feel right. The boy was quiet, staring straight ahead, but his face was blank, expressionless. I didn't answer right away, something inside me urging me to stay silent, to not respond. I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the edge of the curtain. Something was off. The longer I looked at them, the more I could feel it, like a wrongness hanging in the air. I took a step back, instinctively distancing myself from the door, my heart beating faster now. But before I could even fully process my unease, the boy spoke, his voice just as strange and monotone as the girl's. "We need to call our mom. Let us in." I shook my head, even though they couldn't see me. I didn't know these kids. There was no way I was letting them in. My mind raced, searching for any logical explanation as to why they were out here, why they were asking to come inside. But nothing made sense. And then I saw it. Their eyes. I stared in horror as I noticed that both the boy and the girl had the same eyes, completely black. No whites, no pupils, just solid black orbs staring right at me through the window. It was like their eyes were voids, empty and unnatural. It made my skin crawl. I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, unable to tear my gaze away from those awful, dark eyes. My gut screamed at me that something was horribly wrong, that I needed to get away from them, but I couldn't seem to make my legs work. I just stood there, rooted in place, my breath catching in my throat. Then the girl spoke again, her voice a little harsher this time. "Let us in. We need your phone." My heart pounded harder against my chest. I opened my mouth to respond, maybe to tell them to leave or to ask what they were doing here, but no words came out. I couldn't speak. I just kept staring at them, feeling that awful, creeping fear spreading through my whole body. The girl's face twisted then, her calm expression shifting into something far more sinister. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips pulled back into a snarl. She banged her fist against the door, much harder than before. "Let us in," she screamed. Her voice wasn't soft anymore. It was loud, almost guttural, and didn't sound like it belonged to a child at all. The sudden change made my stomach lurch, and I stumbled back from the door, my hand flying to my mouth as I suppressed a gasp. The boy stayed quiet, but he took a step closer to the window. His face was still emotionless, but those black eyes were now staring me, as if he could see straight through me. They started pounding on the door again, both of them this time, their fists hitting the wood with an unnatural force for children their size. They didn't sound like kids anymore. Their voices were deeper, harsher, and their words didn't sound like a request anymore. They were demanding. I backed away further, stumbling over the coffee table as I tried to get away from the door, my heart racing. They kept banging, the noise echoing through the quiet house, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I was terrified, paralyzed by fear, and the only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't let them in. Finally, the banging stopped. Silence filled the room once again, but it was a tense, eerie silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stood there, frozen, barely breathing, listening for any sound. After a long, agonizing minute, I forced myself to move back toward the window. My hands were shaking as I pulled the curtain aside, just enough to peek out again. They were gone. The porch was empty. No sign of the kids, no sign that they had ever been there at all. It was like they had vanished into thin air. I stayed up the rest of the night, my mind racing with fear and confusion, checking the doors and windows every few minutes. Even now, I still don't know who or what they were, but I'll never forget the way those black eyes stared right through me. It was early April, and I was excited to be back on the Appalachian Trail for my second through hike. The air was crisp, the trees just starting to bud, and the path ahead was as familiar as it was inviting. I had started in Georgia, heading northbound just like last time. My pack felt good on my back, and my legs, though a little stiff from the long winter break, were eager to take on the challenge. There's something magical about being out in the wild, disconnected from the chaos of everyday life, and I was ready to embrace it. That first night, nothing out of the ordinary happened. I found a decent spot just off the trail, built a small fire, and cooked a quick meal, some dehydrated chili and a cup of tea. The flames crackled softly as the sky darkened, the stars starting to peek through the canopy above. The woods were peaceful, and the only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of wind through the branches. After the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the gentle sounds of the forest. It was exactly what I'd been looking forward to: quiet, solitude, and the freedom that only the trail could offer. By noon the next day, I was starting to feel the weight of my pack and figured it was time to take a break. That's when I noticed a small clearing, maybe 100 feet off the trail. It looked ideal, a flat, open patch of ground nestled between some trees, with a view that stretched out toward the surrounding woods. I was far enough from the trail to avoid any other hikers who might pass by, but still close enough that I wouldn't get lost finding my way back. It seemed like a good spot to stop for the day, so I dropped my pack and started setting up the camp. As the sun started to sink lower, I made myself a quick dinner, and after cleaning up, I settled into my tent just as the last light faded from the sky. The forest around me was still, the air cooling rapidly now that the sun was gone. It felt peaceful. It was the kind of night that made me love the trail, a quiet serenity that reminded me why I came back. I zipped up my tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and let the gentle sounds of the woods ease me into sleep, completely unaware of what the night still had in store. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had stirred me. It was dark, the kind of inky blackness you only get when you're deep in the woods, far from any city lights. The air inside my tent felt thick, and for a moment, I just lay there, listening. Then I heard it. A soft rustling outside, like footsteps, faint but distinct, just outside the tent. I froze. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. It could have been a deer, I told myself, or maybe a raccoon. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy. They sounded like someone walking slowly around the clearing. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps circled my tent, stopping every few moments before continuing again. My heart pounded in my chest. I was out in the middle of nowhere, and there shouldn't have been anyone else around. Most hikers were still farther south on the trail, and this clearing was off the beaten path. Who could be out here, wandering around my campsite in the middle of the night? Then I heard a voice. It was soft at first, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "Can we come in?" I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I hadn't imagined it. Someone was out there. My first instinct was to ignore it, to hope they'd leave. But then the voice came again, this time a little louder. "We need to borrow your phone." I lay there, silent, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who would be out here, in the middle of the woods, asking to borrow a phone? I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, careful not to make any noise, and reached for the small knife I kept in my pack. My hand shook as I gripped the handle, my mind racing with fear. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay silent, to not engage, but the voice came again, even louder now, and this time there was a second voice, a boy's voice, just as flat and strange. "Let us in. We need to call our mom." My breath caught in my throat. 2 of them. There were 2 people out there. I inched toward the flap of my tent, hesitating before unzipping it just a crack, enough to peer out into the darkness. My heart sank as I saw them. Standing just outside my tent, bathed in the faint glow of the moonlight, filtering through the trees, were 2 kids, a boy and a girl, no older than 8 or 9. They stood side by side, staring straight at my tent. I wasn't sure if it was the darkness or the shock I was going through, but I could swear both of them had eyes that were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just solid dark orbs that seemed to absorb the light around them. "Let us in," the girl said again, her voice still that unsettling monotone. I couldn't move. My hand tightened around the knife, but I knew deep down that it wouldn't do me any good. Something about these kids, if they even were kids, was wrong. Terribly wrong. I wanted to speak, to tell them to leave, but the words caught in my throat. Then the boy stepped closer to the tent, his black eyes locking onto mine through the small opening. His face was blank, expressionless, but there was something menacing in the way he stared at me. "We won't hurt you," he said, his voice colder now, more insistent. "Just let us in." Panic surged through me, and I quickly zipped the tent shut, retreating back into the farthest corner. My heart pounded in my chest as the 2 kids began to circle the tent again, their footsteps slow and deliberate. I could hear them whispering now, their voices too low to make out, but I knew they were talking about me. For what felt like hours, they circled my tent, their footsteps never stopping, their whispers never fading. I stayed still, clutching the knife, praying they would go away. Finally, the footsteps stopped, and the whispering fell silent. I waited, straining to hear any sound. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun began to rise, I packed up my gear and headed back the way I came. There was no way I was spending another night in the woods, knowing they might come back. I worked shifts at the hospital in the next town over. During the COVID pandemic, the hospital was always overcrowded, and my shifts felt endless. It was late, around 11 p.m., after an exhausting 14-hour shift, and all I wanted was to get home and collapse into bed. The road I was driving on was deserted, stretching out before me with only the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. My mind was drifting, barely registering the surroundings, when something caught my attention up ahead, a pair of kids walking along the side of the road. My fatigue made it difficult to process, but the sight struck me as out of place. It wasn't normal to see children wandering around at this hour, especially in such a remote area. I felt a twinge of concern and curiosity, so I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. I rolled my window down just enough to speak to them and called out, asking if they needed any help or if they were okay. They stopped walking and turned to face me. That's when I saw their eyes, completely black, with no whites or pupils, just an inky darkness. My heart began to race uncontrollably. My breath quickened, and I felt a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Instinctively, I rolled the window back up and locked the doors, my hands shaking violently. The girl moved closer to my car, her expression unreadable but intensely focused. She stared directly at me and said, "Can you help us?" Her voice was disturbingly calm, yet there was something unsettling about it that made my skin crawl. I wanted to speak, to reassure myself that this was just a trick of my tired mind, but my throat felt paralyzed. I knew I had to get out of there as quickly as possible, but then, as if orchestrated, the boy joined her. They both moved closer, their faces almost pressing against my window. The girl's voice grew louder, now tinged with a sense of desperation. "Please, let us in." I was frozen, unable to move, my fear escalating as they got even closer. The proximity of their faces against the glass made it hard to think straight. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but the sheer terror was overwhelming. The boy slammed his hand on the window with a force that made me flinch. "Let us in now!" he shouted, his voice echoing with an unnatural intensity that sent chills down my spine. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I felt my entire body trembling. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer, but the thought of driving away while they were so close paralyzed me with fear. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but my legs felt like lead. Summoning every ounce of courage I could muster, I slowly began to reverse, my eyes never leaving the pair of children. They didn't move, just stood there staring with their dark, empty eyes. I backed up as slowly as possible, creating as much distance as I could between us. When I felt there was enough space between us, I hit the gas and sped away. My heart was pounding in my chest like a drum. The deserted road seemed to stretch on forever as I drove, my mind replaying the horrifying encounter in a loop. I couldn't shake the image of their black eyes or the intensity of their demand for entry. I didn't stop until I was safely home, my hand still trembling as I fumbled with my keys. As soon as I was inside, I locked the door behind me, my breath coming in short, shaky gasps. I found it hard to sleep that night. Every creak and rustle of the house made me jump. The day after I tried to rationalize what had happened, was I so exhausted that I imagined the whole thing. I'll never forget the way they looked at me, or the bone-chilling anger in their voices. Whether it was a hallucination from sheer fatigue or a genuine encounter with something not from this world, the fear of that night has stayed with me. We hope these stories gave you chills. Have you ever had a similar experience? We'd love to hear your stories and share them with our community. Leave your experiences in the comments below or send them to us directly. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Your support helps us bring more of these spine-tingling tales to life. Thanks for watching.